Colin Edwards has stood on a MotoGP podium 12 times. Not once, in any of those 12 times, was he standing on the top step. That gap gets stranger the more you look at it. Before MotoGP, Edwards was already a two-time World Superbike champion, beating factory teams from every major manufacturer on the planet, in a sport that does not hand out titles to riders who are simply good enough. He then spent years riding for Yamaha's factory MotoGP team, alongside a teammate many people still call the greatest rider of all time. 12 years in MotoGP, 12 podium finishes, 0 wins. Once, at a fast, wet circuit in Holland, he came within feet of finally breaking that streak, close enough to see the finish line waiting for him, close enough that people who were there still talk about that afternoon now. The easy explanation is that he simply was not fast enough for that level. That talent alone should have been enough, and clearly was not. Plenty of people who followed his career at the time, and plenty who still watch MotoGP today, would tell you exactly that without a second thought. That explanation is wrong. The real one involves a promise he was asked to keep for another rider, a teammate the entire sport had quietly been built around, and one impossible corner in Holland where victory slipped straight out of his own hands. Before any of that can make sense, picture the racer Colin Edwards actually was, long before Yamaha ever signed him. A Texan kid on a dirt track, small enough that grown men underestimated him, then quickly stopped. By the time he reached World Superbike, that same kid had turned into one of the most dangerous riders on the entire grid, the one every rival team built its whole season around trying to beat. He won his first world title in a fight that came down to the very last corner of the very last race of the season, the kind of finish that leaves a rider either a champion or an afterthought, with nothing in between. He won his second the same way, edging out Troy Bayliss, an Australian so relentless on a motorcycle that Edwards himself still describes him, without hesitation, as simply a lion. Beating a lion more than once, on a production-based machine rather than a prototype built by an entire factory the size of Yamaha, is not something a rider without real, proven talent ever manages to do. By the time Colin Edwards signed with Yamaha's MotoGP team, he was not an unproven name hoping somebody would finally give him a chance. He had already spent years proving, race after race, championship after championship, exactly what he was capable of on two wheels. That is the part almost nobody remembers when they hear the words 0 wins. He did not walk into MotoGP hoping to become a champion. He walked in already won. What happened next had nothing to do with whether he could win. What happened next started with a conversation, not a race. Before Edwards had turned a single competitive lap for the factory team, Yamaha's team boss, Lynn Jarvis, sat him down and told him plainly what his job actually was going to be. Yamaha already had its star, Valentino Rossi, and the two men happened to get along well off the bike. Edwards' role, Jarvis explained, was to help keep peace in the paddock and support the rider the entire team had already been built around. Edwards said yes. The contract paid well, and by his own account, he was completely fine with that arrangement at the time it was offered to him. Years later, looking back with more distance, he admitted the decision may have cost him more than he realized in the moment, saying that if nobody had put those particular words in his head, he genuinely thinks he would have ridden differently. Riding alongside Rossi meant more than simply sharing a garage and a set of mechanics. It meant testing new parts before the races that actually mattered, helping tune the bike so the team's real title contender could go faster on Sunday, then lining up an hour later to race against that very same man. Two riders sharing one machine, one openly built to win everything, one openly built to help him do exactly that. Nobody forced Colin Edwards into that role. He chose it, for reasons that made complete sense to him at the time, given what the team was offering and who his teammate happened to be. That did not mean Yamaha would actively stop Edwards from winning a race if the chance came along, but it did mean he entered the factory team already knowing exactly where he stood inside it, long before he ever threw a leg over the actual bike. There is one afternoon Colin Edwards still brings up unprompted, years later, completely unasked, and it is not a win. It is a single corner in Holland, in the summer of 2006, where he held a MotoGP race, and quite possibly an entire career, in his own two hands. Edwards led from the very first lap of the race. Every lap after that, on a track slick with the kind of relentless Dutch rain that punishes any moment of hesitation, he held that position while Nicky Hayden hunted him down from behind, closing the gap corner by corner. 2 laps from the finish, Hayden forced his way past at a fast, blind, committed corner, running Edwards wide onto the runoff and briefly taking the lead for himself. Edwards was not finished. He fought his way back in front of Hayden, and heading into the final corner of the final lap, the win, the one that had eluded him for years of racing at this level, finally belonged to him again. Then, defending that lead in the only way instinct told him to, he cut back across the racing line too hard, caught a curb, and felt his rear tire spin loose on wet grass just off the edge of the circuit. He went down feet from where the finish line was already waiting for him. Hayden rode past and took the win. Edwards picked himself up, remounted his bike, and crossed the line in 13th place. Years later, he still says it plainly, without a single excuse offered. He should have won that race. He says the same thing about a race in Qatar 2 years earlier. Both times he adds simply, "You just have to take it as it comes." That one corner in Holland became the clearest image of Colin Edwards' entire MotoGP career. Not a rider who lacked the raw speed to win. A rider who held a win in his own hands and watched his own instincts reach out and take it away from him. Assen was never really about one mistake in one corner. It was simply the clearest single example of a much bigger problem that followed Colin Edwards through his entire time in MotoGP. Start with exactly who he was racing against. Those years put Valentino Rossi, Nicky Hayden, and a young Dani Pedrosa all on the same grid at the same time, riders who would go on to combine for more world titles between them than almost any generation before or since. Beating one of them on a given Sunday afternoon was hard enough. Beating all of them, week after week, season after season, was close to impossible for anyone who was not already the team's clear top priority. By his own arrangement with Yamaha, discussed openly before he ever signed, Edwards was not. Then there is the machine itself. Winning on a superbike, built from a road-going production motorcycle, rewards a different kind of riding than winning on a pure prototype built purely for outright speed. Edwards had already mastered one of those disciplines completely. MotoGP now asked him to relearn parts of his own craft while simultaneously racing against the best riders in the world at doing exactly that, with no time allowed to catch up. And then there is the one factor Edwards almost never gets asked about directly, the one he brings up himself instead. He believes, plainly, that he simply arrived too late. His own best years on a motorcycle, he has said, came around the age of 28. By the time Yamaha signed him for MotoGP, he was already past 30, and in his own words, probably past his physical peak as a rider. None of these factors explains 12 winless seasons by itself. Together, they explain why a rider who had already proved he could become a world champion never turned that ability into a single MotoGP victory. Then, in the twilight of that career, something happened that had nothing at all to do with winning. At a race in Malaysia, a rider running just ahead of Edwards lost control of his motorcycle in a fast, committed corner, the kind that gives a rider almost no time to react. The bike slid back across the track at speed, directly into the path of both Valentino Rossi and Colin Edwards, who were still racing at full pace right behind him, with nowhere left to go. Neither man had time to see it coming, let alone any real chance to avoid it. The rider was Marco Simoncelli. He did not survive his injuries. Edwards was thrown from his own bike in the collision and dislocated his shoulder. In the days that followed, as questions circled the paddock about what, if anything, could have been done differently, and as replays of the crash aired again and again, he spoke publicly, defending both himself and Rossi, saying plainly and without hesitation that there was nothing either of them could have done to avoid Marco. The words were true, and nobody in the paddock seriously disputed them for long. Edwards raced on for 2 more seasons after that day in Malaysia, finishing out a long career the way he had ridden most of it, race weekend after race weekend. He never said very much publicly about what those 2 remaining seasons actually felt like from the inside. What that crash took from Colin Edwards was not another trophy he never had anyway. It was something closer to the innocence of the sport itself, the simple idea that speed and skill alone were ever the only things that could decide how a career, or a life, actually ends. 2 seasons later, Colin Edwards decided, entirely on his own terms, how his own career would end, and he did it in his own words. By then he was riding for a smaller team, on a bike that never quite suited the way he liked to ride, and everyone around the garage could see it. He did not blame the mechanics working around him, or the sponsors paying the bills, or bad luck in general. He simply told the truth exactly as he saw it, and walked away, rather than pretend otherwise for one more season, just to save face. There was no dramatic farewell tour built around him, no final win to send him off, the way Assen had almost, agonizingly, given him a decade earlier. He rode his last races the same way he had ridden most of his long career, honestly, without excuses, quietly finishing out races that were never going to define him the way one single afternoon in Holland already had. Looking back on all of it now, the titles, the podiums, the crash feat from a finish line, the collision he never asked to be any part of, Edwards has settled on one description that fits a man who stopped needing anyone else's permission to judge his own career for himself. It was, he says simply, a hell of a ride. That might reasonably have been the end of the story. For most riders who walk away like that, quietly and on their own terms, it would be. For Colin Edwards, it turned out to be only the end of his own part in it. Long before he became a racer, Hayes Edwards sat in front of a camera and asked Valentino Rossi what it was like to race alongside his father. He was 12. He asked Maverick Vinales the same question. At the time, Hayes was not a motorcycle racer. He played baseball, a shortstop. 2 years later, a friend invited him to a motocross park in Texas. One visit was enough. Hayes has said plainly that he was tired of depending on other kids for his own success, and decided to go his own way and count only on himself. He chose motocross, the same discipline his own father had raced as a teenager, before Colin Edwards ever switched to pavement. Nobody arranged that to make a tidy point about legacy. A boy who once interviewed his father's old rival grew up, tried something else first, and still ended up where his father had started. Colin Edwards' name will always sit next to a strange statistic: 12 podiums and not one win, in a sport most people believe only rewards first place. But this fuller story was never about a rider who came up short. It is about a champion who ran out of time to prove it twice, in a sport that gave him almost everything except the one thing people remember counting. His son is out there right now, on a bike, still finding his own way into that same world.